we are going to present the Philippine progress prior to 1898. But before we proceed to the book, let's introduce first the authors. The first one is Austin Craig. Austin Craig was an American historian, born in Editon, New York in February 22, 1872. He was one of the first biographers of Philippine national hero Jose Rizal. In 1910, he became the first chair of the Department of History of the University of the Philippines. He was the holder of the Rizal Professional Chair at the University of the Philippines in Padre Faura from 1912 to 1922. Conrado Benitez. Conrado Benitez is a Filipino statesman, writer, and educator. Born in Pagsanhan, Laguna on November 26, 1889. He was the first president as well as chairman, and one of the original incorporators of the Philippine Rural Reconstruction Movement. He was one of the drafters, a group known as the Seven Wise Men of the 1935 Constitution of the Philippines. Now, let's proceed to the book, Philippine Progress Prior to 1898. As you can see, this is the cover of the book. Volume 1, The Old Philippines Industrial Development by Conrado Benitez. Chapter 1, Agriculture and Landholding at the Time of the Discovery and Conquest. Chapter 2, Industries at the Time of Discovery and Conquest. Chapter 3, Trade and Commerce at the Time of Discovery and Conquest. Chapter 4, Trade and Commerce, the Period of Restrictions. Chapter 5, the 19th Century and Economic Development. Austin Craig Part is the Filipinos' part in the Philippines past, pre-Spanish Philippine history. Chapter 1, Agriculture and Landholding at the Time of the Discovery and Conquest. At the time of the arrival of the Spaniards, agriculture in the Philippines was in a comparatively prosperous condition. The Filipinos cultivated rice, which as today, formed their chief article of food. The lands of the ancient Filipinos were divided among the whole barangay. With the coming of the Spaniards, lands were assigned to the colonies, of which they were to have perpetual ownership after 4 years' residence. Chapter 2, Industries at the Time of Discovery and Conquest. One of the most important industries in the Philippines during this period was shipbuilding. As next to rice, fish form an important part of the diet of the Filipinos. We find them engaged in the fishing industry at the time of discovery and conquest. The early Filipinos did not only know how to work mines, but also knew the art of metalworking. They used metal for some of their weapons. Chapter 3, Trade and Commerce at the Time of Discovery and Conquest. Before Spanish discovery, the Filipinos were in regular intercourse with the neighboring countries of China, Japan, Borneo, and others. There is a chapter on Philippine trade, from which we learn that the foreign traders import porcelain, commercial gold, iron bases for perfumes, leaden objects, glass, pearls of all colors, iron needles, etc. In exchange, the Filipinos exported cotton, perhaps the kapok or tree cotton. Chapter 4, Trade and Commerce, the Period of Restrictions. Hardly had wealth been created by the commerce of the first years after the conquest, when the policy of restriction found its strong supporters in the merchants of Cadiz and Seville, who accustomed to monopolize the trade with America. In 1593, a decree absolutely limited the trade between Mexico and the Philippines to 250,000 pesos annually for the exports to Mexico and to 500,000 pesos for the imports from Mexico to be carried in 2 ships not to exceed 300 tons burden. Chapter 5, The 19th Century and Economic Development. There are several ways by which capital may cooperate in the development of a new territory. The first is where capital in the form of stocks of commodities of all kinds is advanced or sold upon credit by the commercial houses. This has been used in this country. The second way by which capital may cooperate is by providing transportation facilities to connect a new country with the markets, and especially with those so necessary to its prosperity. The building of the Manila-Dagupan Railroad, for example, has had a remarkable influence upon the economic progress of the provinces through which it passed. Thus, is explained why it is that the opening of the Philippines to the outside world caused great social changes. Now, the Austin Craig's part is the Filipinos' part in the Philippine past, pre-Spanish Philippine history. The pre-Spanish Philippine history during the first years of the conversion conquest was tabooed because of its pagan and infidel associations. Whatever had to do with the past, the many records there must have been in a land where literacy is reported to have been general, was religiously destroyed by the missionaries. A suggestion of the antagonism to historical research appears in the frequent assertions of Spanish writers from 1888 to 1898 that the only Philippine history was the chapter of Spanish history dealing with Spain in the Philippines. Now let's proceed to the book review. A book review by Princess Nicole de Jesus and Jocelyn Pelagia. Assess the author's use of primary and or secondary sources. The authors use primary sources because some of the chapters of these is their own observations. But the authors also use secondary sources in this book because they use different work of various authors to create the other chapters of this book. Philippine Progress prior to 1898. Describe the way the author approaches his or her topic, the rigor of the research and scholarship, the logic of the argument, and the readability of the prose. When you read this book, you will see how the authors did their best to make this book really interesting and for the readers to be able to read this book easily because the content is well organized. Evaluate the book's merits, usefulness, and special contributions along with shortcomings you think are necessary to point out. This book will give us knowledge of the important and interesting events that happened way back 1898. This book is really informative. There is no shortcomings that necessary to point out in this book. The book's merit is about how the authors describe, in Chapter 2, that the early Filipinos did not only know how to work mines, but also knew the art of metal working. They used metal for some of their weapons. Mention at least one memorable aspect of the book, so that at the end of class, we will remember something distinctive about your book. As mentioned in Chapter 1, agriculture in the Philippines is in a prosperous condition even before. Filipinos are really prosperous in agriculture. Up until now, we can see the hard works of our farmers. Philippine is rich when it comes to agriculture